I'm going to tell you something I've kept secret for 50 years. 50 years without telling a soul. Not my children, not my friends, not even my older sister Sarah, who's been my confidant for everything. People still ask me to this day, Helen, how did you do it? How did you survive 52 years with John? And I always smile and change the subject. But today I'm going to tell the truth. My name is Helen. I'm 73 years old. I've been a widow for 3 years now, living alone in the same farmhouse in rural Kansas where I spent over 5 decades of my life. And I'm finally ready to share the story that everyone in our county has been whispering about since 1967. The story of how a 16-year-old girl tamed the farmer that 7 women couldn't handle. When I got married, I was only 16 years old. 16! It was 1967. I was a farm girl from the middle of nowhere, Kansas, virgin, pure, didn't know anything, nothing at all. My mother never properly explained how things worked between a man and a woman. John was 35 years old. He was a rancher, a rich man, respected throughout the county. But he had a reputation that everyone in the region knew about. They said he was big, very big, too big, and that he was hard, thick, impossible to handle. The women were afraid of him. The men respected him, but the women trembled just hearing his name. 7 brides ran away from him before me. 7. Some ran away a week before the wedding. Others ran away on the honeymoon itself, on the very first night. They'd come back to their parents' houses crying, desperate, saying, I can't do it. I can't handle him. He's too big, too hard. I can't take it. One of them was bedridden for 3 days. She was so hurt. Another never wanted to marry again after that, traumatized for the rest of her life. The church ladies would whisper when I walked by, poor Helen, so young, so tiny. How is that girl going to handle that man? He's going to break her. He's going to hurt her. He's too big for a girl her size. And I'd hear them, but I didn't really understand. I was too innocent. A neighbor came up to me 3 days before the wedding and said, Honey, are you sure? John is very, very big, you understand. He's thick, he's hard. He doesn't know how to control his strength. He goes at it with everything he's got, no mercy, no gentleness. The others couldn't handle it. Some even bled a lot, got hurt badly. You're too young for this. My own mother cried the night before the wedding. She held my hands and said, Helen, my daughter, I'm scared for you, very scared. John he's different. He's too much for you. But now everything's settled. There's no turning back. You're going to have to endure it. Even if it hurts, even if it's difficult, you're going to have to endure it. I got married without really knowing what awaited me, and on the honeymoon, on our first night together, I found out. I discovered the truth about John. I discovered why 7 women couldn't stay with him. I discovered why they said he was big, hard, impossible to handle. And you won't believe it when I tell you, because it wasn't what you're thinking. Let me back up a little bit. I need you to understand who I was before all this happened. I need you to understand the world I came from, the way I was raised, the values that were drilled into me from the time I was old enough to walk. Because without that context, you won't understand why I stayed, why I didn't run like those 7 women before me, why I became the only woman who could tame John. I was born in 1951, right here in rural Kansas, Bible Belt territory, small farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where you went to the Baptist church every Sunday without fail, where the Word of God and the Word of your Father were equally sacred. It was a different time. A simpler time, some would say, a harder time, others would argue. But it was the only time I knew, and the rules were clear. Men provided, women submitted. Men made decisions, women followed them. Men were the head of the household, women were the heart of the home. That's just how it was. Nobody questioned it. Nobody fought against it. It was as natural as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. I was the 5th child in a family of 9. 5 girls, 4 boys. My father, George, worked a small cattle ranch with some wheat fields. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. We had food on the table, clothes on our backs, a roof over our heads. It was an honest, decent life, a hard life, but a dignified one. And I was raised to be obedient. From the time I was a little girl, my mother taught me, Helen, a woman must be gentle. She must be obedient. She must know how to keep house, cook, clean, sew. A man doesn't marry a woman who talks back, a lazy woman, a woman who doesn't know how to take care of a home. And I learned everything, everything. By the age of 16, I could cook a full meal, clean an entire house, sew and mend clothes, tend a garden, milk a cow, gather eggs, and care for children. I woke up at 5 in the morning every single day. I was ready to be a wife, ready to be obedient, ready to submit to whatever my husband required of me. But I wasn't ready for John. Nobody could have prepared me for John. John was a legend in our county, not the good kind of legend, not a hero or a saint. No. John was the kind of legend that mothers whispered about when they warned their daughters. The kind of legend that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their chairs when his name came up at the bar over whiskey and cards. He was a big man, 6'3", probably 220 pounds of pure muscle from decades of ranch work. He had hands like bear paws, calloused and strong. His voice was deep as a well, rumbling like distant thunder when he spoke, which wasn't often. John was a man of very few words. He owned over 1,000 acres of prime Kansas land, cattle ranch, wheat fields, a dozen employees. He was rich, probably the richest man in the county. The kind of rich where people called him Mr. John, with a certain tone of respect tinged with fear, because John commanded respect, and John commanded fear. But what John couldn't command, apparently, was a wife. 7 times he'd tried to get married, 7 times he'd failed, and every single time, the story was the same. The women would start out excited, maybe a little nervous, but willing. They'd get through the engagement, get through the wedding planning. Some even made it to the altar. But something always happened, something that made them run, something that made them cry and scream and refuse to go back to him no matter what their families said. The whispers in the community were relentless. At the general store, at church potlucks, at the county fair. Always the same questions, the same speculations. What was wrong with John? What did he do to those women? Why couldn't any of them handle him? And the answer, according to the gossip, was always the same. He was too big, too hard, too rough. The women couldn't physically handle him. He was too much man for any woman to bear. I heard all the stories. I heard about the bride who locked herself in the bathroom on her wedding night and wouldn't come out until her father came to take her home. I heard about the widow who everyone thought would be experienced enough to handle him. But even she gave up after 2 months. I heard about the girl who came back from her honeymoon with bruises, though nobody ever confirmed if they were from John or from something else. I heard it all, and I was terrified. Because on a Sunday morning in 1967, right after church services, John approached my father. He was 35 years old. I had just turned 16 the day before, and he asked my father for my hand in marriage. My father said yes. Just like that, without asking me, without warning me. My father shook John's hand, smiled, and sealed my fate. I was going to marry the man that 7 women had run away from. I was going to become the 8th bride of John the rancher. And everyone in the county was already placing bets on how long I'd last. 3 months, that's how long my engagement lasted. 3 months of pure terror as I waited for my wedding day, listening to the warnings from the church ladies, the advice from married women who pulled me aside to prepare me for what was coming. 3 months of wondering what exactly John was going to do to me that made grown women flee in the middle of the night. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about fear. When you're terrified for long enough, when you've imagined every horrible possibility, there's a part of you that just wants to get it over with, that just wants to know. Even if the knowing is terrible, at least it ends the not knowing. So on my wedding day, when I walked down the aisle of that Baptist church in my simple white dress with everyone staring at me with pity and curiosity, I wasn't thinking about love or romance or happily ever after. I was thinking, tonight I'm going to find out. Tonight I'm going to discover what those 7 women discovered, and then I'll know. And I did find out. But like I said, it wasn't what anyone was thinking. Not even close. But before I tell you what happened on that wedding night, you need to understand who I was. You need to understand the world that shaped me. Because without that, you won't understand why I made the choices I made, why I stayed when 7 women before me had run. I was born in March of 1951 in a small farmhouse about 15 miles outside of Wichita, Kansas. My parents, George and Martha, had been married for 10 years by then and already had 4 children. I was number 5. 4 more would come after me. 9 children total, born over the span of 18 years. That's just how families were back then. Big, loud, always working. My father was a cattle rancher and wheat farmer. He owned about 200 acres, which wasn't much compared to the big operations, but it was enough to keep us fed and clothed. He raised Herefords mostly, beautiful red and white cattle that he was proud of. And every spring, he'd plant wheat across the fields that stretched as far as a child's eye could see, golden waves that rippled in the Kansas wind come summer. Daddy was a hard man. Not cruel, but hard. He believed in discipline, in obedience, in the old ways of doing things. He'd wake up at 4:30 every morning without fail, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. He'd pull on his boots, his worn Wrangler jeans, his button-up work shirt, and his Stetson hat, and he'd head out to tend the cattle before the sun even thought about rising. He had a saying that he repeated so often it might as well have been carved into the wooden beams of our house. In this family, I'm in charge. What I say goes. No arguments, no backtalk, no nonsense. And he meant it. When Daddy spoke, everyone listened. When Daddy gave an order, everyone obeyed. It wasn't a democracy. It wasn't a discussion. It was a hierarchy, and Daddy was at the top. My mother, Martha, was the backbone of that household. She had to be, with 9 children to raise and a husband who worked from dawn to dusk. She was up before my father every morning, firing up the wood-burning stove, making coffee strong enough to strip paint, preparing breakfast for a family of 11. Biscuits from scratch, gravy made with sausage drippings, eggs from our own chickens, sometimes bacon or ham from the pigs we'd slaughtered in the fall. Mama never complained. Not once. Not when she was pregnant for what seemed like half her adult life. Not when money was tight and she had to make 1 chicken stretch across 3 meals. Not when she was so tired she could barely stand, but still had laundry to wash by hand in the big tin tub out back. She just did what needed to be done, day after day, year after year. She taught me everything she knew. How to cook, how to clean, how to sew, how to preserve food for winter, how to tend a garden, how to care for chickens and collect eggs without getting pecked. But more than the practical skills, she taught me something else. Something that would shape my entire life. She taught me how to be a wife. I remember one afternoon when I was about 14 years old, sitting at the kitchen table snapping green beans from the garden. Mama was rolling out pie crust, her strong arms working the rolling pin back and forth with practiced ease. And she said to me, without even looking up, "Helen, you're getting to be a woman now. Soon enough, some man is going to come asking your daddy for your hand. And when that happens, you need to be ready." I asked her what she meant by ready. She stopped rolling, wiped flour from her hands onto her apron, and sat down across from me. Her face was serious, the way it got when she was about to teach me something important. "Being a wife is the most important job a woman can have," she said. "More important than anything else you'll ever do. A man needs a woman who can keep his house, cook his meals, bear his children, and most importantly, obey him. In everything. Without question, without complaint. Even when it's hard." "Even when it's hard?" I asked. I was young. I didn't fully understand what she meant. She looked at me with eyes that had seen things, endured things, survived things that she would never speak about out loud. "Especially when it's hard, Helen. That's when a wife proves her worth. Any woman can be pleasant when things are easy. But a real wife, a godly wife, she obeys even when she doesn't want to, even when she doesn't understand, even when it costs her something. She reached across the table and took my hand. Your daddy is a good man. He provides for this family. He works himself to the bone to keep a roof over our heads. And in return, I give him my obedience, my respect, and my loyalty. That's the bargain. That's how a Christian marriage works. And that's what you'll do too when your time comes. I nodded, storing her words away in my heart. Because in my world, in 1965 in rural Kansas, what Mama said was gospel truth. It wasn't oppression. It wasn't abuse. It was just the way things were. The natural order, as ordained by God and practiced by generations before us. I went to the small Baptist church in town every Sunday without fail. Our whole family did. We'd pile into Daddy's old Ford pickup truck, the younger kids in the back, and drive the 7 miles to the white clapboard church with the tall steeple that you could see from the highway. We'd sit in the same pew every week, 4th row on the right side, and we'd sing the hymns and bow our heads during prayer and listen to Pastor Williams preach about sin and salvation and the proper order of things. The proper order, according to Pastor Williams, was clear. God, then husband, then wife, then children. That was the chain of command. That was how God designed it. And to disrupt that order was to invite chaos and sin into your home. I believed it. I truly did. It wasn't brainwashing or indoctrination. It was just what everyone believed, what everyone had always believed. The water we swam in, so constant and surrounding that we didn't even notice it was there. I went to school in a 1-room schoolhouse about 3 miles from our farm. I walked there and back every day with my siblings, carrying my lunch in a tin pail. I learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and a little bit of history, but I only went through the 4th grade. When I turned 11, Daddy pulled me out. That's enough education for a girl, he said. You don't need algebra or science. You need to learn how to run a household. That's your future, Helen. Not books, not school. A home and a family of your own. So I stopped going to school and started working full-time at home. I woke up at 5 every morning, just like Mama. I'd help her make breakfast, clean up the dishes, tend the garden, gather eggs from the chicken coop, help with the younger children. In the afternoons, I'd do laundry by hand, scrubbing clothes on a washboard until my knuckles were raw. I'd hang them on the line to dry, then bring them in and iron them with a heavy flat iron heated on the stove. I learned to cook everything: pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fried chicken with cream gravy, cornbread that was crispy on the outside and soft in the middle, apple pie from the apples in our own orchard, biscuits so light they practically floated off the plate. I could butcher a chicken, pluck it, clean it, and have it on the table in under an hour. I could churn butter, make cheese, preserve vegetables in mason jars for the winter. By the time I was 16, I was ready to be a wife, ready to run a household of my own, ready to serve a husband, bear his children, and build a life according to God's design. Or at least, I thought I was ready. I was a small thing, just 5'2" and maybe 95 pounds soaking wet. I had long dark brown hair that I wore in braids most days, brown eyes, and what people called a sweet face. I was shy, quiet, obedient. I never talked back, never caused trouble, never questioned authority. I was exactly what a man of that time and place would want in a wife. The church ladies called me Sweet Helen. They'd pat me on the head after services and say things like, "What a lovely girl, so well behaved, so helpful to her mother. She's going to make some lucky man a wonderful wife someday." Daddy would beam with pride when he heard comments like that. "I raised her right," he'd say. "Raised her to be a proper woman, not one of these modern girls who think they can do whatever they please." I didn't know any other way to be. The idea of rebelling, of questioning, of wanting something different never even occurred to me. This was my destiny. This was what God had planned for me, to be a helpmeet to a man, to bear his children, to keep his home. And then, on a Sunday morning in March of 1967, the day after my 16th birthday, everything changed. John approached my father after church services. and my fate was sealed. John was already a legend by the time I was old enough to understand what that meant. In a county of maybe 5,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else's business, John stood out. Not in a good way, in a complicated way, in a way that made people whisper. He was 35 years old in 1967, which made him almost 20 years older than me. He'd never been successfully married, though God knows he'd tried. 7 times he'd tried. 7 engagements, 7 weddings planned or executed, 7 complete failures. That kind of track record doesn't just make people curious. It makes them talk. It makes them speculate. It makes them create stories to explain what they can't understand. Physically, John was an imposing man. He stood about 6'3", which was tall for that generation, especially in our farming community where most men topped out around 5'10" or so. He was broad across the shoulders and chest, built like someone who'd spent his entire life doing hard physical labor, which he had. He'd been working his family's ranch since he was a boy, and by the time he inherited it at 21, he'd already transformed into this massive, powerful presence. His hands were enormous. I remember noticing them even before we were engaged, seeing them at church wrapped around a hymnal, making the book look like a child's toy. They were calloused and scarred, with thick fingers and prominent veins, working hands. Hands that could wrestle a steer to the ground, repair a fence post, or operate heavy machinery without a second thought. His face was weathered from years in the Kansas sun. Deep-set eyes, dark brown, almost black. A strong jaw that he kept clean-shaven. Thick eyebrows that made him look perpetually stern. And a voice. Lord. That voice. It was deep and rumbling, like distant thunder rolling across the prairie. When John spoke, which wasn't often, people stopped what they were doing and listened. Not because what he said was particularly profound, but because that voice commanded attention. He wore the same thing almost every day: Wrangler jeans, button-up work shirts in various shades of plaid, a leather belt with a simple silver buckle, scuffed work boots, and a tan Stetson hat that had seen better days. On Sundays, he'd clean up a bit, put on pressed slacks and a white shirt, but he still wore the boots and the hat. That was just John. He drove a Ford F-250 pickup truck, dark green, always dusty from the ranch roads. He lived alone in the big farmhouse that had belonged to his parents, a 2-story, white-clapboard structure that sat in the middle of his property like a castle overlooking a kingdom. Over 1,000 acres. That's what John owned. 1,000 acres of prime Kansas land, hundreds of head of cattle, wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. He employed about a dozen men full-time, ranch hands, farm workers, people who depended on John for their livelihoods, and by all accounts, he was a fair employer. He paid on time, he paid well, and he didn't cheat anyone. But he was demanding. Very demanding. He expected perfection, or as close to it as human beings could achieve. And if you disappointed him, you'd know it. Not because he'd yell or curse. John didn't do that. He'd just look at you, and that look was worse than any shouting could ever be. The men in town respected John. They'd tip their hats when he walked by. "Morning, Mr. John." "Afternoon, Mr. John." Always Mr. John, never just John. There was a formality there, a distance. He wasn't the kind of man you clapped on the back or invited to play poker on Friday nights. He existed in his own sphere, separate and above. But it was the women who really gossiped about John, because of the brides, the 7 brides who couldn't handle him. The first one, I later learned, was named Elizabeth. This was back in 1954, when John was only 22 years old. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper from the next town over. Pretty girl, 19 years old, excited to marry into money and land. They got engaged, set a date, sent out invitations. And then, 1 week before the wedding, Elizabeth disappeared. Just vanished in the middle of the night. Left a note for her parents saying she couldn't go through with it, that she'd rather die an old maid than marry John. Her parents were mortified. They searched for her, found her 3 days later staying with an aunt in Topeka. And when they demanded to know why she'd run, she just shook her head and cried. "I can't," she kept saying. I just can't. Don't make me. Please don't make me. Nobody ever found out exactly what made Elizabeth run. But people talked. Oh, how they talked. Maybe John had told her something. Maybe she'd discovered something. Maybe she'd heard stories from other women. The speculation was endless. The second bride actually made it to the altar. Her name was Dorothy, and she was 23, a widow whose first husband had died in a farming accident. Everyone thought Dorothy would be different. She was older, more experienced, more mature. She'd already been married once. Surely she could handle John. The wedding was beautiful. I've seen pictures. Dorothy in a lovely white dress, John in a dark suit looking uncomfortable but determined. The reception at the Grange Hall with half the county in attendance, and then they left for their honeymoon. They were going to stay at a hotel in Kansas City for a week. They didn't make it through the first night. Dorothy came back the very next morning, still wearing her traveling clothes, her face pale and her hands shaking. She went straight to her parents' house, locked herself in her childhood bedroom, and refused to come out for 2 days. When she finally emerged, she filed for an annulment. Wouldn't say why, wouldn't explain, just kept repeating, I made a mistake, I can't be married to him, I can't. The third bride was named Margaret. She was 25, a schoolteacher, considered very sensible and level-headed. She lasted 3 days. 3 days of marriage before she packed her bags, called her brother to come get her, and left John's farmhouse swearing she'd never return. When people asked Margaret what happened, she'd gone a bit further than the others in explaining. He's not normal, she said. He's too much, too demanding, too intense. No woman could live with that. No woman could endure it. But endure what? That was the question everyone wanted answered, but no one could quite get a clear response to. The fourth bride, Patricia, lasted a week. The fifth, Susan, lasted exactly 1 night before following Dorothy's example. The sixth was a woman named Carol, who was 28 and had been engaged once before to a different man. She tried to stick it out. She really did. She lasted 2 months, but in the end, even Carol gave up. And then came Ruth. Ruth was 32, a widow with 2 children from her previous marriage. She was practical, no nonsense, experienced in the ways of the world and the ways of men. Everyone was certain that if anyone could handle John, it would be Ruth. She'd already been married. She'd already borne children. She knew what she was getting into. Ruth lasted the longest of all of them, 4 months. 4 months of trying, of enduring, of attempting to make it work. And then one day, she loaded her 2 children into her car and drove away while John was out working the fields. She left everything behind, her clothes, her furniture, her hopes for the future, just took her children and fled. After Ruth, John didn't try again for 3 years. 3 years of living alone in that big farmhouse, working his ranch, coming to church on Sundays, and sitting by himself in the back pew. People started to think he'd given up on marriage altogether. Some felt sorry for him. Poor Mr. John, they'd say, condemned to live alone. Others were less charitable. There must be something seriously wrong with him, they'd whisper. 7 women don't run away for no reason. And the speculation, Lord, the speculation was wild. The church ladies would huddle together after services, their voices low, but not quite low enough. I heard he's abnormally large, one would say. Down there, you know. Huge, like a horse. No woman can accommodate that. Another would chime in. It's not just the size, it's that he's rough. He doesn't know his own strength. He hurts them. Others had different theories. Maybe he's got some kind of deformity. Maybe he's violent. Maybe he's got unnatural desires. Maybe he's just too demanding in the bedroom. The rumors got more and more elaborate, more and more scandalous. The men didn't talk about it as openly, but you'd catch hints of it at the feed store or at the diner. John's too much man, someone would say with a knowing nod. Some women just can't handle a real man. And there'd be uncomfortable laughter, the kind that covers up curiosity and maybe a little bit of fear. Nobody knew the truth. John never explained, never defended himself, never addressed the rumors or the gossip. He just kept to himself, worked his ranch, came to church, and endured the whispers. And then, In March of 1967, 3 years after Ruth had left him, John decided to try one more time. He saw me at church. Sweet little Helen, fresh-faced and 16 years old, sitting with my family in our usual pew. I didn't even know he was looking at me. Didn't know he was considering me. Didn't know that my fate was about to be decided without my input or consent. And the next day, he approached my father. It was the Sunday after my 16th birthday, March 12th, 1967. I remember the date because it changed everything. The day before, Mama had baked me a simple yellow cake with chocolate frosting, and we'd sung Happy Birthday around the kitchen table after supper. 16 felt momentous. In our world, 16 meant you were a woman. You were ready for marriage, ready for children, ready for the responsibilities of adult life. That Sunday morning was typical Kansas spring weather, cool and crisp, with a bright blue sky and just a hint of warmth promising that summer wasn't too far off. We all piled into Daddy's pickup truck like we did every Sunday, the younger kids in the bed, the older ones squeezed into the cab. I wore my Sunday dress, a pale blue cotton one that Mama had sewn for me, with my hair pulled back in a neat braid, white ankle socks and my good black shoes that I only wore to church. The service was normal. We sang Amazing Grace and the Old Rugged Cross. Pastor Williams preached about obedience to God's will, which seemed particularly relevant in hindsight. We took communion, passed the collection plate, said our closing prayers. Just another Sunday morning in rural Kansas, 1967. When the service ended, we all filed out of the church like we always did, congregating on the front lawn in little clusters. The men would talk about weather and crops and cattle prices. The women would discuss recipes and children and upcoming church events. The kids would run around playing tag or marbles while their parents socialized. Our family was standing near the big oak tree that shaded the church entrance, talking with the Hendersons about their new calf, when I saw John walking toward us. Actually, I felt him before I saw him. There was just something about his presence that made people turn and look. He was wearing pressed gray slacks, a white button-up shirt, and his Stetson hat. His boots were polished, which was unusual for John. My heart started beating faster, though I didn't know why. John had never spoken to me directly, never even really looked at me that I could remember. We existed in completely different worlds. He was a wealthy landowner in his mid-30s. I was a farm girl barely 16. What would John want with my family? He walked straight up to my father, removed his hat, and held it in his hands. "Mr. George," he said in that deep voice of his, "I wonder if I might have a word with you, in private." I saw my father's eyebrows raise in surprise, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. John, of course." And the two of them walked about 20 yards away, over near the church cemetery where they could talk without being overheard. But everyone was watching. You couldn't not watch. John rarely spoke to anyone at church, kept to himself mostly. For him to approach someone for a private conversation was notable. The entire congregation seemed to pause, conversations trailing off, everyone's attention subtly focused on those two men standing by the cemetery fence. I stood there with my mother and siblings, pretending not to stare, but stealing glances. I could see John talking, see my father nodding, see them shake hands. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then they walked back. My father's face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach clench with an unnamed anxiety. "Let's head home," he said. "We need to talk as a family." The drive home felt eternal. Nobody spoke. Even the younger children seemed to sense that something significant had happened, something that required silence. When we pulled up to our farmhouse, Daddy didn't head to the barn to change clothes like he usually did. Instead, he said, "Everyone in the living room, now." We all filed in and sat down. Mama on the old sofa, the younger kids on the floor, me and my older siblings in the wooden chairs. Daddy stood by the fireplace, still in his Sunday clothes, his face serious. "Helen," he said, looking directly at me, "Mr. John has asked for your hand in marriage, and I've given him my blessing." The room went completely silent. I felt like someone had knocked the air out of my lungs. My ears were ringing. Marriage? To John? The John who 7 women had run away from? The John who everyone whispered about? The John who was 19 years older than me? Daddy, I started, but he held up his hand. It's decided, Helen. Mr. John is a good man, a godly man. He owns a successful ranch. He provides well. He's respected in the community. This is a blessing, a real blessing. Most girls your age would be thrilled to marry a man of his standing. I looked at my mother. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when I knew she was scared. Scared for me. But she would never contradict my father. Not in front of the children. Not ever. When is the wedding? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. 3 months. Mr. John wants a short engagement, just enough time for you to prepare your trousseau and for the banns to be read at church. The wedding will be in June, 2nd Saturday. 3 months. I had 3 months before I became the 8th bride of John. 3 months before I discovered whatever it was that had sent 7 women before me running. My younger sister Mary, who was 13, raised her hand timidly. Daddy? What about those other women? The ones who didn't stay married to Mr. John? My father's jaw tightened. That's gossip and foolishness. Those women didn't understand what it meant to be a proper wife. They didn't understand obedience and commitment. But your sister Helen, she's been raised right. She knows her duty. She'll honor her vows. Isn't that right, Helen? All eyes turned to me. What could I say? In my world, in 1967 in rural Kansas, when your father gave his blessing to a marriage proposal, that was the end of the discussion. You didn't argue. You didn't refuse. You accepted God's will as interpreted by your father. Yes, Daddy, I said quietly. I'll honor my vows. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, my mother slipped into my bedroom. I was lying in my small bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She sat down on the edge of the mattress and took my hand. In the moonlight coming through the window, I could see tears glistening on her cheeks. Mama? I whispered. Oh, Helen, she said, her voice breaking. My sweet girl, I'm so scared for you. Those words terrified me more than anything else could have. My mother was the strongest woman I knew. She never showed fear, never showed weakness. For her to admit she was scared. What is it, Mama? What's wrong with him? Why did all those women leave? She squeezed my hand tighter. People say John is different. That he's very large. Too large. And that he doesn't know how to be gentle. That he's too rough, too demanding. The women, they couldn't handle it. Some of them were hurt. Physically hurt. One woman, Dorothy, she bled for days afterward. Another one couldn't walk properly for a week. I felt ice in my veins. But Daddy said I have to marry him. I know, baby. I know. And you do. There's no going back now. Your daddy gave his word. But I need you to be prepared. It's going to hurt, Helen, especially the first time. With any man, it hurts the first time. But with John, it's going to be worse. Much worse. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small bottle. This is whiskey. Your daddy's whiskey. On your wedding night, before it happens, you drink some of this. Enough to make you feel warm and fuzzy. It'll help. It'll make it hurt less. I took the bottle with shaking hands. How much should I drink? A few good swallows. Enough to relax you, but not so much you get sick. And Helen. She paused, seemed to struggle with her words. Don't fight it. Don't resist. The more you tense up, the more you fight against it, the worse it'll be. Just close your eyes, say your prayers, and let it happen. Eventually, it'll be over. And then you just have to endure it whenever he wants it. That's a wife's duty. Over the next 3 months, the warnings kept coming. Women from church would pull me aside with advice that ranged from practical to terrifying. Mrs. Henderson told me to bring thick towels for the bleeding. Mrs. Patterson said I should pray for strength and endurance. Mrs. Wilson, who was 80 if she was a day, patted my hand and said, Just remember, dear, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. My older sister Sarah, who'd been married for 2 years and had a baby, tried to explain the mechanics of what would happen. She was blushing and stammering through the whole conversation, but she did her best. And when she finished, she looked at me with genuine pity. That's with a normal man, Helen. But John, everyone says John is much bigger than normal, so it's going to be really difficult. You just have to breathe through it and remember that millions of women have survived this. John came to visit every Sunday afternoon during our engagement. He'd arrive at 2 o'clock, stay until 4, always with my parents present. We'd sit in the living room, him in Daddy's armchair, me on the sofa across from him. He'd ask me questions. Did I know how to cook? Yes. Did I know how to keep house? Yes. Did I understand that a wife's duty was to obey her husband? Yes. Did I understand what would be expected of me? I nodded, not trusting my voice. He never smiled, never tried to charm me or court me or make me feel special. This was a transaction, a practical arrangement. He needed a wife. I was available and properly trained, that was all. He never touched me during those visits, never held my hand, never tried to kiss me, never even sat next to me. He kept his distance, watching me with those dark eyes, assessing me like he might assess a heifer he was considering purchasing. The night before the wedding, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in my childhood bed for the last time, listening to the familiar sounds of the farmhouse settling, and tried to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. I prayed. Oh, how I prayed. Dear God, please give me strength. Please help me endure whatever I have to endure. Please don't let it be as bad as everyone says. Please, please, please. But my prayers felt like they were bouncing off the ceiling, going nowhere. Morning came anyway, and with it, my wedding day. I woke up at dawn on my wedding day, though I'm not sure I'd actually slept. My stomach was in knots. I could hear Mama already moving around downstairs, stoking the fire in the kitchen stove, starting coffee. The smell of it drifted up through the floorboards. Under normal circumstances, that smell meant comfort, home, safety. That morning, it just made me feel sick. My wedding dress hung on the back of my bedroom door. Mama had made it herself, working by lamplight after everyone else had gone to bed. It was simple, white cotton with long sleeves, a modest neckline, and a full skirt that fell to my ankles. A white dress for a white wedding, for a virgin bride marrying a man who'd already had 7 wedding nights. Sarah came into my room around 7 to help me get ready. She brought a basin of warm water and helped me wash, then brushed out my long hair until it shone. She pinned it up carefully, weaving in small white flowers that Mama had ordered special from the florist in town. The veil was borrowed from our cousin, a simple tulle piece that would cover my face during the ceremony. As she worked, Sarah kept up a steady stream of nervous chatter, talking about anything except what was really on both our minds, the weather, the garden, her baby's teething troubles. But her hands were shaking as she fastened the tiny buttons down the back of my dress. When she was done, she turned me to face the small mirror hanging on my wall. I barely recognized myself. I looked older somehow. My face was pale, my eyes too large, my lips pressed together in a thin line. I looked like a girl playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. I looked terrified. "You look beautiful, Helen," Sarah said, but her voice cracked. I turned to her. "Sarah, tell me the truth. Is it really as bad as they say?" She bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. "With a normal man, it's uncomfortable at first. It hurts a little, but you get used to it, and eventually it's not so bad. But John..." She trailed off. "But John what?" "John is not a normal man, Helen. Everyone knows that, and I'm scared for you. I'm so scared." She grabbed my hands. "But you're strong. You're stronger than those other women. You can endure this. You have to." The wedding was at 10 o'clock at our Baptist church. When we arrived, the parking area was already full of trucks and cars. It seemed like the entire county had turned out. though I suspected it was more curiosity than celebration. Everyone wanted to see if the eighth bride would actually go through with it. I waited in the small room at the back of the church with my father while the guests filed in. Through the door, I could hear the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the occasional burst of laughter quickly stifled. I clutched my small bouquet of wildflowers so tightly my knuckles were white. "You ready, daughter?" Daddy asked. I wasn't. I absolutely wasn't. But what I said was, "Yes, Daddy." The organ began playing "Here Comes the Bride." My father offered me his arm. The doors opened, and I walked down the aisle toward my future. The church was packed, every pew full, people standing along the walls. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, saw the mixture of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. Some of the older women were actually crying. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mrs. Patterson looked like she was attending a funeral instead of a wedding. And at the front of the church, standing next to Pastor Williams, was John. He looked enormous in his black suit. His shoulders seemed to fill the entire space at the altar. His face was solemn, unreadable. His dark eyes were fixed on me as I walked toward him, and I felt like prey being watched by a predator. My legs were shaking so badly I was afraid I might fall. When we reached the front, my father placed my hand in John's. John's hand was huge, rough, warm. It completely engulfed mine. I felt how strong it was, how easily it could crush my small fingers if he chose to. The thought made me dizzy. Pastor Williams began the ceremony. I barely heard the words. Something about holy matrimony, God's design, submission, and love, the traditional vows. "Do you, Helen Marie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, to love, honor, and obey, as long as you both shall live?" My mouth was dry. My throat felt closed. I had to force the words out. I do. "And do you, John Matthew, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, to love, cherish, and protect, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." His voice was firm, loud, certain. No hesitation at all. The ring. A simple gold band that John slid onto my finger. It was too loose. I'd have to get it sized. His hands were steady as he did it. Mine were trembling. "By the power vested in me by the state of Kansas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you man and wife. John, you may kiss your bride." This was it, my first kiss. John reached up and carefully lifted my veil, folding it back over my head. His face was inches from mine. I could see every detail, the weathered skin, the lines around his eyes, the stern set of his mouth. And then he leaned down. The kiss was brief, chaste, just a press of his lips against mine. But even that small contact made me acutely aware of his size, his strength, his masculinity. He smelled like soap and leather and something else, something earthy and male that I didn't have words for. When he pulled back, I was breathing hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. John just looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then turned us to face the congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Williams announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. John Matthew Tucker." Applause. Polite, subdued applause. We walked back down the aisle together, John's hand firmly gripping my elbow. Out into the bright June sunshine. People were throwing rice. Someone was taking photographs. It all felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else. The reception was at the Grange Hall, tables laden with food that the church ladies had prepared. Fried chicken, potato salad, coleslaw, biscuits, pies, cakes. A 3-tier wedding cake that Mama had spent 2 days decorating. People eating, talking, congratulating us. John stayed by my side the entire time, his presence overwhelming. Men would come up to shake his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. John." "Best wishes, sir." Some of them would give him these knowing looks, these little smirks. "Treat her gentle now, you hear? Go easy on the little lady." And they'd laugh, that uncomfortable male laughter that made me want to disappear. The women were worse. They'd hug me, their eyes glistening with tears, and whisper things in my ear. "Be brave, honey. God give you strength. Just remember to breathe." As if I was going off to war instead of on my honeymoon. I couldn't eat. My stomach was clenched too tight. I pushed food around on my plate and smiled when people spoke to me and counted the minutes until this would be over. Except when it was over, something worse would begin. Around 3 o'clock, John leaned close to me and spoke quietly into my ear. "It's time to go." My heart stopped. Already? It was still daylight. I thought we'd stay until evening at least. But John was already standing, offering me his hand. I took it because what else could I do? We said our goodbyes. My mother hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and when she pulled back, her face was wet with tears. "I love you, my brave girl," she whispered. My father shook John's hand firmly. "She's yours now, John. She'll be a good wife to you." I raised her right. As if I was a horse he'd trained and was now selling. John's truck was parked outside. Someone had tied tin cans to the back bumper and written "Just Married" on the back window in white shoe polish. He opened the passenger door for me, helped me climb in with my full skirt, then walked around and got in the driver's side. He started the engine. We pulled out of the parking lot, the tin cans clattering behind us, people waving and cheering. And then we were on the county road, driving away from everything familiar, heading toward John's ranch, toward his house, toward his bedroom. The drive took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of almost complete silence. John kept his eyes on the road. His jaw was set, his hands tight on the steering wheel. I sat pressed against the passenger door, my hands folded in my lap, trying to slow my breathing. Finally, he spoke. "You scared?" I didn't know how to answer that. Was I allowed to admit fear? Would it anger him? I settled for honesty. "Yes, sir." He nodded once, as if that was the answer he expected. "That's normal. All the others were scared too." A pause. Didn't help them none, though. My blood ran cold. What did that mean? Didn't help them. What had happened to those 7 women that being scared didn't help? We turned onto his property, drove down the long dirt driveway lined with fence posts and barbed wire. And then there it was. The big white farmhouse that would be my home, my prison, my fate. John parked the truck, came around, opened my door, offered his hand to help me down. His palm was rough against mine. We walked up the front steps together. He opened the door. The house was quiet, dark. He'd given all his ranch hands the weekend off. We were completely alone. No one to hear if I screamed. No one to help if I needed help. John led me through the living room, down a hallway, to a closed door. The bedroom. He opened it. The room was large, dominated by an enormous bed. A bed that suddenly seemed threatening, ominous. The sight of whatever had sent 7 women running. My wedding trunk was already there in the corner, delivered earlier that day. John gestured to it. "Your things are there. There's a bathroom through that door. You can change into whatever you need to change into." I grabbed my nightgown from the trunk with shaking hands and practically ran to the bathroom. I closed the door, leaned against it, tried to catch my breath. This was it. This was really happening. I changed out of my wedding dress with fumbling fingers, hung it carefully on a hook, put on the white cotton nightgown that Mama had sewn. It was modest, long-sleeved, floor-length, with a high neck, but it suddenly felt revealing, vulnerable. I remembered the bottle of whiskey Mama had given me, tucked into my trunk. Should I drink some now? Would it help? My hands were shaking too badly. I'd probably spill it. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the sink. Pale face, wide, frightened eyes. I looked like a child playing dress-up, and I was about to face whatever it was that had broken 7 grown women. "God help me," I whispered. Then I opened the bathroom door and stepped into the bedroom to meet my fate. When I came out of that bathroom, John was sitting on the edge of the bed. He'd taken off his suit jacket and tie, rolled up his shirt sleeves. He looked even bigger somehow, more intimidating without the formal wedding clothes. His forearms were thick with muscle, covered in dark hair. His hands rested on his knees, those enormous hands that could do God knows what. He looked up when I entered, his dark eyes sweeping over me in my white nightgown. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood there frozen, my back practically against the bathroom door, as far from the bed as I could get while still being in the room. "Come here, Helen," he said quietly. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and I'd been raised to obey. My legs felt like water, but I forced them to move. 1 step, 2 steps, 3, until I was standing directly in front of him, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached up slowly, and I flinched. I couldn't help it. But he just took my hand, gently, and pulled me down to sit beside him on the bed. The mattress dipped under our combined weight, rolling me slightly toward him. I tried to steady myself, tried to stop shaking. "You're terrified," he observed. His voice wasn't unkind, just matter-of-fact. "Yes, sir," I whispered. "You know about the others, the 7 before you." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "And people have told you things. About me. About why they left." Another nod. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. Then he stood up abruptly, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. He walked to the window, looked out at the darkening Kansas sky. His back was to me, his shoulders tense. "Helen, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before today. But I didn't because I didn't know how. I don't know how to talk about this kind of thing. Never have been good with words." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. This was it. He was going to tell me what was wrong with him. What deformity or perversion or violence had sent 7 women fleeing. He turned back to face me. "What people say about me, it's not exactly true. But it's not exactly false either. The 7 women who left, they left for a reason, a real reason. But it's not what folks think." "I don't understand," I managed to say. He walked back to the bed, sat down again. But this time he angled himself to face me directly. "Those women left because they couldn't handle who I am, not what I am, who, my personality, my way of being." I blinked, confused. "Your personality? I'm not an easy man to live with, Helen. I know that. I've always known it. I'm hard. I'm rigid. I'm controlling." He said the last word like it tasted bitter. "I like things a certain way, my way, and I don't bend. I don't compromise. I don't know how to be soft or flexible or easygoing." This wasn't what I'd expected to hear, at all. I just stared at him, trying to understand. He continued, "When I wake up in the morning, I wake up at 4:30, every single morning, no exceptions. And I expect breakfast to be ready at 5 o'clock. Not 5:15, not 4:45, 5 o'clock. Hot coffee, eggs, bacon, biscuits. The same every day, made the way I like it. No variations. When I come in for lunch, I expect the table set, food ready, house clean. When I come in for supper, same thing. I expect my clothes washed and pressed, my floors swept, my dishes done. I expect order. I expect routine. I expect perfection." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "And I know how that sounds. But it's not just about having a clean house or good meals. It's about control. I need to feel in control of my environment, of my life. I need things to be predictable, ordered, managed. When they're not, I get difficult." The first bride, Elizabeth, she found out before the wedding what I expected. I was honest with her, told her exactly what life with me would be like. The routine, the rules, the way things would have to be. She ran. Said she wouldn't live like a prisoner, that she wanted a partnership, not a dictatorship. Dorothy, the second one, she tried. She really tried. But on our first morning together, she made the coffee wrong, too weak. I told her I needed it stronger. She said it was fine the way it was, that I was being too picky. I told her in my house, things are done my way. She argued with me, told me I was being unreasonable. By noon she was gone. I was starting to understand, but I was still confused. But people said, they said you were too big, too rough, that the women were hurt. For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. They said I was too big and too hard. They weren't wrong. My personality is too big, too hard, too much for most women to handle. But they assumed, he shrugged. People assume what they want to assume. I never corrected them because, frankly, it was none of their business. Margaret, the third bride, she lasted 3 days. She was a school teacher, used to being in charge of her classroom. She thought she could organize our household her way, change my routine to something more reasonable. When I told her no, that we'd do things my way, she called me a tyrant and left. Patricia made it a week. She was messy, disorganized, left dishes in the sink, clothes on the floor. I told her that wasn't acceptable. She said I was obsessive, that I needed to relax. I told her I don't relax. She left. Susan lasted 1 night, just one. Not because of anything physical, but because I laid out the expectations, all of them, the schedule, the rules, the way things would be. She listened for about an hour, then started crying, and said she couldn't live like that. She was gone by morning. Carol tried for 2 months, longest of the early ones. She was determined to change me, to soften me, to make me more flexible. But I don't change, Helen. I don't soften. I am what I am. And when she finally accepted that, she left too. And Ruth. Ruth was practical, experienced. She thought she could handle anything. And maybe she could have, if she didn't have children from her previous marriage. But she did. And when I expected those children to follow my rules, my schedule, my way of doing things, they rebelled. And Ruth chose her children over me. Can't fault her for that. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. That's it, Helen. That's the terrible secret. That's what sent 7 women running. I'm demanding. I'm inflexible. I'm controlling to the point of being impossible. I want things done exactly my way, exactly when I say, exactly how I specify. And I don't know how to be any different. I sat there, processing everything he'd just said, and slowly, very slowly, the crushing weight of fear started to lift. Because this I could handle. This I'd been trained for my entire life. So when people said you were big and hard and rough, I said slowly, they meant your personality, your temperament. Yes. And the women who left, they left because they couldn't accept your need for control and order. Yes. There's nothing physically wrong with you, nothing that would hurt me. He looked genuinely surprised by the question. Physically, no. I'm just a regular man in that regard. Maybe I wasn't as gentle as I should have been with some of them, but that's because they were fighting me, resisting, scared, made everything harder than it needed to be. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Mr. John, I don't understand. Why didn't you just tell people? Why let them think? Because it wasn't anyone's business, and because I figured if a woman couldn't accept me as I am, I didn't want her anyway. I wanted someone who could look at my life, at my requirements, and say yes without trying to change me. He turned to face me fully. That's why I'm telling you all this now. Before anything happens between us, before we consummate this marriage, because you need to know what you're agreeing to. You need to understand that if you stay, if you accept this, you're accepting a life of complete obedience, of following my rules, my schedule, my way of doing things, every day, for the rest of your life. And if I can't, I asked quietly, then I'll take you back to your parents tomorrow. We'll get the marriage annulled. I'll tell people it didn't work out, same as the others. You won't be the first to leave, and nobody will blame you. But if you stay, his dark eyes bore into mine. If you stay for good. You commit, you obey, you make this work. Do you understand? I understood. Finally, completely, I understood. John wasn't a monster. He wasn't deformed or violent or perverted. He was just a man with an almost pathological need for control, for order, for routine. A man who'd been honest about what he needed and had been rejected 7 times for it. And I'd been raised my entire life to be exactly what he needed. Obedient, hardworking, skilled in housekeeping, accustomed to following orders without question, trained to submit to male authority. Those 7 women before me, they'd been independent. They'd had their own ideas about how to run a household. They'd wanted partnership, compromise, flexibility. They'd wanted to change John, but I didn't need to change him because I'd already been shaped to fit his requirements. I looked at this man, this legendary figure who'd terrified me for months, and for the first time I saw him clearly, not as a monster, as a man, a difficult man certainly, a demanding man, but a man I could manage. "I'll stay," I said. When I said, "I'll stay," something changed in John's face. It was subtle, just a slight relaxation around his eyes, a barely perceptible exhale. Relief. That's what I saw. This hard, imposing man who owned 1,000 acres and commanded respect from every person in the county was relieved that I wasn't going to leave him. That's when I realized something important, something that would shape our entire marriage. John wasn't just demanding and controlling. John was terrified of abandonment. 7 times he'd tried to build a life with someone. 7 times he'd been rejected. And each rejection had made his walls thicker, his rules stricter, his control tighter. He wasn't a tyrant by nature. He was a wounded man using control as armor. But I was 16 years old. I didn't have the vocabulary for psychology or trauma. I just knew, instinctively, that I'd been given information the other 7 women hadn't had before their wedding nights, and I could use that information. "I'll stay," I repeated, more firmly this time. "I'll be the wife you need. I'll follow your rules, your schedule, your way of doing things. I promise." He nodded slowly. "Good, that's good." He stood up. "It's late. We should sleep. Tomorrow we start the routine. 4:30 wake up, breakfast at 5. I'll show you the kitchen, where everything is, how I like things done." "Yes, sir," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "You don't have to call me sir. John is fine." "Yes, John." That first night, we slept in the same bed, but he didn't touch me, didn't even come close to me. He stayed on his side, I stayed on mine, and we both lay there in the darkness, strangers bound by vows and expectations. I fell asleep eventually, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day, and when I woke up at 4:30 to his alarm clock, he was already out of bed, pulling on his work clothes. "Kitchen's downstairs," he said without looking at me. "I'll be down in 5 minutes. Coffee better be started." I threw on my robe and ran downstairs. The kitchen was huge, much bigger than the one I'd grown up with. Modern appliances, a big gas stove, a new refrigerator. Everything was immaculately clean, organized with an almost military precision. I found the coffee pot, the coffee, the filters, got it brewing, found eggs in the refrigerator, bacon, butter, cast iron skillet on the stove. By the time John came down, I had coffee poured, bacon frying, eggs ready to crack. He sat at the head of the table, picked up the coffee mug, took a sip, waited. "2 eggs over easy," he said. "Bacon crisp but not burned. 2 biscuits with butter and honey. And the coffee needs to be hotter, almost boiling." "Yes, John." I made the adjustments, served him exactly what he'd specified. He ate in silence while I stood by the stove, waiting to see if he needed anything else. When he finished, he stood, put his plate in the sink, and headed for the door. "I'll be in the south pasture checking fence lines. Lunch at noon, pot roast, potatoes, carrots, dinner at 6, fried chicken, green beans, cornbread." And he was gone. That was day 1, and I'll be honest, those first few months were the hardest of my life. Not because John was cruel or violent, but because his standards were impossibly high, and his patience was non-existent. If the coffee wasn't hot enough, he'd pour it out and make me make it again. If the eggs were overcooked by even 30 seconds, he'd tell me they were wrong. If there was a single dish left in the sink when he came in for lunch, he'd point at it and wait while I washed it. If his work shirts weren't pressed perfectly, he'd hand them back to me without a word. He never yelled. That would have been easier somehow. Instead, he'd just give me this look of disappointment, this slight shake of his head, this silence that screamed louder than any words could. And then, I'd have to do it again, and again, until it was perfect. I cried myself to sleep more nights than I can count in those early months. Cried from exhaustion, from frustration, from feeling like nothing I did was ever good enough. My hands were raw from washing and scrubbing. My back ached from bending over the stove and the wash tub. My feet hurt from standing all day. But I didn't quit. I didn't run. I'd given my word, and more importantly, I'd figured something out, something crucial. John was testing me, just like he'd tested the other 7. He was pushing, demanding, being impossibly difficult, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to tell him he was unreasonable, to argue with him, to fight back. Because that's what the others had done. And the moment they fought back, the moment they challenged his control, he knew they wouldn't work out. So I didn't fight. I obeyed. I learned. I adapted. And something interesting started to happen. About 3 months in, I'd finally figured out exactly how John liked his coffee. The precise ratio of grounds to water, the exact temperature, the specific mug he preferred. I served it to him one morning, and he took a sip, paused, and said, "Good, that's good." 2 words, just 2 words, but they felt like winning the lottery. That's when I realized that John wasn't incapable of praise. He just needed to feel like his standards were being met first. And once they were, once I proved I could deliver exactly what he wanted exactly how he wanted it, he started to soften. Incrementally, almost imperceptibly. But I noticed. I also started to notice patterns. John needed control, yes, but he needed it most in certain areas. The kitchen, the cleanliness of the house, his personal belongings, those were sacred. But other things, things he didn't specifically mention, those had a little flexibility. So I started experimenting, carefully, strategically. John liked his food heavily salted, salted to the point where I could barely eat it myself. So for the first few months I made it exactly that salty. But then, gradually, over weeks and weeks, I started reducing the salt. Just a tiny bit at a time. So slowly he couldn't consciously notice the change. And he never complained, never sent a meal back. By 6 months in, the food was seasoned normally, and John thought it was still exactly the way he liked it. Same with other things. He didn't like conversation during meals, wanted silence. So I gave him silence for months. But then I started making small comments, just 1 per meal. "The weather's nice today." Nothing that required a response, just a statement. He'd grunt or nod. Then after a few weeks, I'd ask a simple question. "How are the cattle doing?" He'd give a 1-word answer. "Fine." But it was a start. Gradually, over months, I got him talking. Not a lot. John was never going to be a chatty man, but he started volunteering information about his day, mentioning problems with the ranch, telling me about his plans. And here's the key thing I figured out. John liked being consulted. He liked being asked for his opinion. It fed his need for control while making him feel valued. So I started asking him about everything. "John, should I plant tomatoes or peppers in the garden?" "John, should I make apple pie or cherry pie for Sunday dinner?" "John, do you prefer the blue curtains or the white ones for the living room?" At first he seemed surprised by the questions, like no one had ever asked his opinion about domestic matters before. But he'd consider carefully and give me an answer, and I'd follow his decision exactly, which made him feel respected, in control, important. And then I added something else to my strategy. I started praising him. Every single day, I'd find something genuine to compliment. "You work so hard, John. I've never seen anyone as dedicated as you. You're so knowledgeable about cattle. I learn something new every time you explain things to me. I feel so safe with you, so provided for." The first few times I did this, he looked uncomfortable, didn't know how to respond, would just grunt and change the subject. But I kept doing it. And I noticed that after I praised him, he'd be slightly less rigid that day, slightly more patient when I made a small mistake. By our first anniversary, John was a different man with me. Not different with the ranch hands, not different with the people in town. He was still hard, still demanding, still controlling with them. But with me, in our home, he'd softened by maybe 40%. He started doing small things, bringing me wildflowers he'd found in the pasture, thanking me for dinner without being prompted, asking if I needed anything from town before he went, putting his hand on my shoulder when he walked past. Small things, but they meant everything. By year 2, he was consulting me on ranch decisions. "Helen, what do you think? Should I sell this lot of cattle now or wait until fall? Helen, should I hire another hand or can we manage with what we have?" He valued my input, trusted my judgment. And that's when I knew I'd done it. I'd figured out what 7 women before me couldn't figure out. You can't break John, you can't change John, you can't fight John, but you can shape John, slowly, patiently, strategically, like water wearing down stone, not by force, but by persistent, gentle pressure. The church ladies would ask me, "Helen, how do you do it? How do you live with him?" And I'd just smile and say, "Patience and prayer." But that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was, respect his control in the things that matter to him, gently redirect the things that don't, praise him constantly, ask his opinion, never fight him directly, and make him feel like every small change was his idea. It wasn't submission. Well, it was, but it was strategic submission. It was choosing which battles didn't need to be fought because they weren't battles at all. It was understanding that John's need for control came from fear, and that the more secure he felt, the less control he needed. Those 7 women before me, they'd seen John's demands as oppression, as unreasonable tyranny, and they'd fought against it or fled from it. But I saw it as John's language of fear, and I spoke that language back to him in a dialect of patience, strategy, and carefully measured affection. And it worked. By God, it worked. We were married for 52 years, 52 years. When I tell people that, they look at me like I've claimed to climb Mount Everest in my bare feet. 52 years with John Tucker? How did you survive? And I always say the same thing. I didn't just survive. I lived, and they were good years. Our first child came 11 months after the wedding, a boy. We named him John Jr., though we called him Johnny. When I told John I was pregnant, I was nervous. Would this disrupt his precious routine? Would he resent the chaos a baby would bring? Instead, I watched that hard, stoic man sit down heavily in his chair and put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. He was crying. John Tucker, who I'd never seen show much emotion at all, was crying. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Helen. Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for staying." That's when I fully understood. John had wanted a family desperately, had tried 7 times to build one, and 7 times he'd failed. He'd started to believe he'd die alone in that big house with no children, no legacy, no one to carry on his name. During my pregnancy, John changed. He insisted I rest more, hired a woman from town to come help with the heavy cleaning. He'd come in from the fields during the day to check on me, make sure I was feeling all right. He started talking more, asking me how I was feeling, if the baby was moving, if I needed anything. When Johnny was born, John held that tiny baby in his enormous rough hands and wept again. "My son," he kept saying, "my son." He was 37 years old and holding his firstborn child, something he'd thought would never happen. We had 4 more children over the next 8 years. Mary, then Matthew, then Martha, and finally little George, named after my father. 5 children total, and with each one, I watched John soften a little bit more. Oh, he was still demanding, still controlled the household with his rules and routines. But he was gentler about it now, more patient. And with the children, he was different than I'd expected. He was strict, yes, very strict. He expected them to do their chores without complaint, to speak respectfully, to obey immediately. But he was never cruel, never violent, never demeaning. He taught them by example, working alongside them, showing them how to do things the right way. And he made sure they respected me. That was non-negotiable. "Your mother runs this house when I'm not here," he'd tell them. "What she says is law. If I hear about any of you disrespecting her, you'll answer to me." And they believed him. My children grew up honoring their mother because their father demanded it. With our daughters, John was surprisingly protective, almost overly so. "These girls are going to have educations," he announced when Mary started school. "They're going to finish high school. They're going to know their worth before any man comes asking for them." Both our daughters graduated high school, which was rare for girls in our community in the 1970s and 80s. John made sure of it, and when young men came calling, John would sit them down in his study and have what he called a conversation. More than one boy left our house pale and sweating, but the ones who stayed, the ones who eventually married our daughters, they were good men. Men John had vetted thoroughly. The years passed. The children grew. The ranch prospered. And John continued to evolve. By our 15th anniversary, he'd started showing physical affection. Not much, but enough that I noticed. He'd kiss my forehead when he left in the morning, hold my hand when we sat on the porch in the evenings, put his arm around me at church. He started calling me my Helen. "Where's my Helen?" he'd ask when he came in from the fields. "My Helen makes the best pot roast in Kansas," he'd brag to the ranch hands. It was his way of saying he loved me, I think. John was never good with the actual words, but he found other ways to say it. When I got pneumonia in our 20th year of marriage, John fell apart. He sent for the doctor immediately, hired round-the-clock help, and barely left my bedside. I was delirious with fever for 3 days, and later my sister Sarah told me that John had sat beside my bed the entire time, holding my hand, praying. John, who rarely showed emotion, who prided himself on stoic strength, had prayed out loud for God to spare me. "Don't leave me, Helen," he'd said, Sarah told me. "Don't leave me alone again. I can't do this without you. I can't live without you." When I recovered, he was different. More openly affectionate, more verbal about his appreciation. "I love you" was still hard for him to say, but he'd say things like, "You're a good wife, Helen, the best wife. I don't deserve you." Our children left home one by one. Johnny went off to college, came back to help run the ranch. Mary married a farmer from the next county. Matthew became a veterinarian. Martha married a teacher and moved to Wichita. George went into the military. And then it was just John and me again, just like those first years, except everything was different now. We'd built a life together, raised 5 children, survived hardships, and celebrated joys. We knew each other completely. Our routine was still there. John still wanted his coffee at 5 a.m., still expected meals on time, still needed his order and control. But it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was just us. It was our dance, our rhythm, our way of being together. Sunday mornings we'd go to church, sit in the same pew we'd sat in for decades. John would hold my hand during the sermon, his rough thumb rubbing circles on my palm. After church, we'd drive to the diner in town, have lunch together, maybe stop by to see one of the kids and the grandchildren. Evenings, after dinner, we'd sit on the front porch. I'd shell peas or snap beans, and John would whittle or read the farming reports. We didn't need to talk much. The silence between us was comfortable, companionable. Sometimes he'd tell me stories about his day, problems with equipment, decisions about cattle, interactions with the hands. He'd ask my opinion, genuinely considerate. We were partners, real partners. On our 40th anniversary, John did something unprecedented. He took me to dinner at a fancy restaurant in Wichita. He wore a suit. I wore my best dress. And over dessert, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Helen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I'm not an easy man. I know I've been hard on you, demanding, difficult. But you stayed. You stayed when 7 others ran. You stayed and you built a life with me. You gave me children. You gave me a home. You gave me everything." He cleared his throat. "I'm not good at saying things, never have been, but I need you to know that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. The only good thing, really. Everything I have, everything I am, it's because you chose to stay." I was crying by then. "John, I love you. I've loved you for so long." "I love you too, Helen. I should have said it more, should have said it every day, but I'm saying it now. I love you." We sat there in that restaurant, two old people holding hands across the table, and I felt completely, utterly content. This hard, difficult, demanding man had become my whole world, and I was his. The last 12 years were the best. John was in his 70s, still working the ranch but slowing down a bit. He'd let Johnny take over most of the day-to-day operations. We had more time together, more quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. He'd surprise me sometimes, bring me coffee in bed, which was completely against his routine, leave little notes around the house. "You're beautiful. Thank you for lunch. Love you." His handwriting was terrible, but those notes were treasures. 3 years ago, John went out to check on the cattle in the south pasture. It was a Tuesday morning, early May, beautiful weather. He kissed my forehead before he left, said, "See you at lunch, my Helen." Those were the last words he ever said to me. The ranch hand found him an hour later. Massive heart attack. He was gone before he hit the ground. The doctor said he didn't suffer, didn't even know what was happening. Just here one moment, gone the next. I was devastated. 52 years we'd been together, and suddenly I was alone. The house felt enormous and empty. The silence that had once been comfortable was now oppressive. I'd wake up at 4:30 out of habit, then remember there was no one to make coffee for. The funeral was huge, hundreds of people. John had been respected in the community, and everyone came to pay their respects. People told stories about him, about his fairness as an employer, his business acumen, his dedication to his family. But they didn't know the real John. They knew the hard exterior, the demanding boss, the stern man who kept to himself. Only I knew the John who cried when his children were born, the John who held my hand through pneumonia, the John who left love notes in terrible handwriting. That John was mine alone. These past 3 years have been hard. I miss him every day. Miss his routine, his demands, his presence. The house is too quiet. The mornings are too empty. But I don't regret a single day of our 52 years together. Not one day. Because yes, John was difficult. Yes, he was demanding and controlling and hard to live with. But he was also loyal and faithful and devoted. He provided for his family. He protected his children. He loved me in the only way he knew how. And I loved him back. Not in spite of who he was, but because of who he was. The real John. The one underneath all that armor. That's what those 7 women before me never understood. They saw John's demands as problems to be fixed. But I saw them as language to be learned. And once I learned his language, once I understood what he was really saying underneath all those rules and routines, everything else fell into place. Was it a perfect marriage? No. Was it easy? Hell no. But it was real. It was lasting. It was built on understanding, strategy, patience, and eventually, deep, abiding love. And that's worth more than all the easy romances in the world. But now I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone. Not my children, not my sister, not my closest friends. Something I discovered about 6 months into my marriage that changed everything. That made me understand John in a way no one else ever could. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn 1967. John had gone into town to meet with the bank about expanding the ranch. He'd be gone for a few hours. I was cleaning the house, doing my usual routine, when I decided to tackle John's study. His study was off limits normally. John was very particular about that room. It was his space, his sanctuary, and he didn't like anyone going in there. But he'd given me permission to dust and sweep, as long as I didn't move anything on his desk or touch his filing cabinets. I was dusting the bookshelf, reaching up high to get the top shelf, when my elbow knocked against an old shoebox that had been pushed way back in the corner. It fell, hit the floor, and the lid came off. Papers spilled everywhere. My heart jumped into my throat. John would be furious if he knew I'd knocked something down, even accidentally. I quickly got on my knees and started gathering the papers, trying to put everything back exactly as it had been. That's when I saw the photograph. It was old, yellowed with age, the edges worn. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, beautiful, with dark hair and kind eyes. She was holding a baby, maybe 6 months old. The baby had a serious little face, dark eyes just like the woman's. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Mary and John, 1932. John and his mother. I'd never seen a picture of John's mother before. He never talked about his family, never mentioned his childhood. I'd asked once, early in our marriage, and he'd shut down completely, told me the past was the past, and we didn't need to discuss it. But here she was, Mary Tucker, John's mother. I should have just put everything back. I know I should have. But I didn't, because underneath that photograph were letters, dozens of letters, all in the same handwriting, all addressed to "My dearest John." I picked up the first one. My hands were shaking. I knew I was violating John's privacy, knew I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But something in me needed to know, needed to understand where my husband came from, what had made him the way he was. The first letter was dated 1942. John would have been 10 years old. It was written in beautiful cursive script, the kind they don't teach anymore. "My dearest John," it began. "I know this is hard for you being away from home. I know you don't understand why your father and I made this decision, but please trust me, my son. This is for the best. You're safe where you are. You're being cared for. And someday, when you're older, you'll understand why we had to do this." Away from home? At 10 years old? I quickly reached for another letter, this one dated 1944. "My dearest John, I received your letter asking when you can come home. My darling boy, I wish I could give you the answer you want, but the truth is complicated. Your father is not well. The war has changed him. He came back different, John, angry, violent. It's not safe for you here right now. Please understand. I'm keeping you away because I love you, not because I don't want you. His father was violent. John had been sent away to protect him from his own father. I felt my chest tighten as I reached for the next letter. This one was dated 1947. John would have been 15. "My dearest John, I have to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it except plainly. Your father is dead. He died 3 days ago. I'm sure people will tell you it was a farming accident, that a tractor rolled over on him. That's what we're telling everyone. But you deserve the truth. Your father took his own life. He couldn't live with what he'd become, what the war had done to him. He left a note, but I burned it. Some things are better left unknown." Oh God! John's father had killed himself, and John had been away, separated from his family, during all of it. I kept reading, my heart breaking with each letter. There were letters from when John was 17, 18, 19. His mother writing to him at various addresses. He'd never come home, I realized. Even after his father died, he'd stayed away. And then I found a letter from 1950 when John would have been 18. "My dearest John, I'm writing to beg your forgiveness. I made a choice when you were 10 years old, a choice that I thought was right at the time. I sent you away to protect you from your father's violence. But in protecting you from him, I abandoned you to something else, something I didn't see until it was too late. The place I sent you, the people I trusted to care for you. I was wrong, John. I was so wrong. And by the time I understood what was happening to you there, the damage was done. You won't speak to me about it. You won't tell me what they did to you. But I see it in your eyes. I see how you've changed, how hard you've become. And I know it's my fault. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the paper. What had happened to John? Where had his mother sent him? What had been done to him? I dug deeper into the box, found official documents, a placement form from something called Hargrove Boys Reformatory School. Dated 1942. John had been sent to a reformatory? But why? What had a 10-year-old boy done to be sent to a reformatory? Then I found a newspaper clipping, yellowed, fragile, dated June 1943. The headline read, "Hargrove Reformatory under investigation for alleged abuse." The article talked about boys being subjected to harsh discipline, inadequate food, physical punishment. Several staff members had been arrested. John had been there for years, from age 10 to, I looked at more documents, to age 16, 6 years in that place. And then, at the very bottom of the box, I found an envelope, different from the others, thicker paper, and on the front, in that same beautiful handwriting, it said, "To be opened after my death." Inside was a letter, dated 1952, the year John's mother died. "My dearest John," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps now you can finally be free of the burden I placed on you. But before I go, there's one more truth you need to know. One more secret I've carried all these years." I read the next paragraph, then read it again. My vision blurred. My hands went numb. Because what was written there, what his mother confessed to in that letter, it explained everything. Why John was the way he was. Why he needed control so desperately. Why he couldn't let anyone close. Why 7 women had run from him. It wasn't just about his demanding personality. It was about trauma, deep childhood trauma that had shaped every single aspect of who he became. I heard John's truck pull up outside. He was back early. I quickly, frantically, shoved everything back into the box, put it back on the shelf, and ran out of the study. When John came in, I was in the kitchen pretending to prepare dinner, my heart hammering so hard I thought he'd hear it. "Helen?" he called out. "In here," I managed to say. He came into the kitchen, kissed my forehead like he'd started doing. "Smells good. What's for dinner?" "Pot roast," I said, not meeting his eyes. He paused. "You all right? You seem off." "I'm fine. Just tired." He accepted that and went to wash up, and I stood there, wooden spoon in hand, my mind reeling from what I'd just learned. That night, lying in bed next to my husband, I looked at him differently. This hard, controlling, demanding man suddenly made perfect sense. The rigid routines, they gave him the control he'd been denied as a child. The need for order, it was safety. The inability to show emotion, protection against more pain. And I made a decision that night. I would never tell him I knew. Never bring it up. Never force him to relive those memories or explain that trauma. But I would love him harder. I would be more patient with his demands. I would understand that every rule, every routine, every moment of rigidity was John trying to build walls around a boy who'd been broken. And that's what I did, for 52 years. John died never knowing that I'd read those letters. Never knowing that I knew about the reformatory, about his father's suicide, about the years of abuse and neglect. Never knowing that I understood the real reason he was the way he was. But I knew, and it changed everything. Because I wasn't just managing a difficult man. I was loving a survivor, a man who'd built himself up from nothing, who'd overcome a childhood of trauma and abandonment, who'd created success and stability out of chaos and pain. Those 7 women before me, they'd seen his demands and run. But if they'd known what I knew, if they'd understood where those demands came from, maybe they would have stayed too. Or maybe not. Maybe it took someone like me, someone raised to be patient and obedient, someone willing to look deeper and love harder. I'll never know. What I do know is that John Tucker wasn't just a difficult man who needed a submissive wife. He was a wounded boy who grew into a man who needed someone strong enough to see past his armor and patient enough to wait for him to feel safe. And I was that someone. But the full story, What exactly happened at that reformatory? What was in that final letter from his mother? The secret she'd kept all those years. That's a story for another time. If you want to know the whole truth, you'll have to come back for part 2. I'm 73 years old now. I've been a widow for 3 years, and I still live in this house, the house where I spent 52 years of my life with John. Sometimes I go into his study, pull down that old shoebox, and read those letters again. Read that final letter from his mother, the one that revealed the truth about who John really was. And every time I read it, I cry. I cry for the little boy who was sent away. I cry for the teenager who suffered things no child should suffer. I cry for the man who built walls so high that 7 women couldn't climb them. And I cry because he died never knowing that I knew. Never knowing that someone had seen all of him, the broken parts and the strong parts, and had chosen to stay anyway. People ask me all the time, "Helen, do you have any regrets?" And I always say no. But that's not entirely true. I have one regret, one single regret that haunts me. I regret not telling him that I knew. I regret not sitting down with him one evening, maybe 20 years into our marriage, when we were solid and secure, and saying, "John, I found the letters. I know about the reformatory. I know about your father. I know what happened to you. And I want you to know that none of it was your fault. None of it makes you less. And I love you not in spite of what happened to you, but I love you more because you survived it." Maybe it would have helped him. Maybe it would have freed something in him that had been locked away since he was 10 years old. Maybe he would have cried, really cried, and released some of that pain he'd been carrying for decades. Or maybe it would have destroyed him. Maybe the humiliation of knowing that someone knew his secrets, even his wife, would have been too much. Maybe it would have broken the fragile trust we'd built. I'll never know, and that's what keeps me up at night sometimes. But I also wonder, did he know that I knew? Really? Deep down? Did he suspect? Because there was a moment, maybe 5 years before he died, when something happened that makes me think maybe he did. We were sitting on the porch one evening. It was summer, fireflies blinking in the dusk, crickets singing. I was shelling peas. He was just sitting, staring out at his land. And out of nowhere he said, "Helen, why did you stay?" I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "That first night, when I told you what I was like, what I'd require. You could have left, should have left probably. Why didn't you?" I thought about my answer carefully. Because I saw something in you that night. Something underneath all the demands and the rules. Something that needed someone to stay. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the only person who ever really saw me. You know that? The only one who looked past everything else and saw me." My throat got tight. "I know." "Even the parts I never told you about?" His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "Especially those parts," I said. He turned to look at me then, and there were tears in his eyes. He didn't say anything else. Just reached over and took my hand, held it tight, and we sat there in the gathering darkness, 2 old people holding hands. And I think we both understood that we understood each other completely. So maybe he did know. Maybe that was his way of telling me that he knew I knew, and that it was okay. That he trusted me with his secrets even though he couldn't speak them out loud. I'd like to think that's true. Now I know what you're all wondering. You're wondering what exactly was in that final letter from his mother. What was the secret she revealed? What happened at that reformatory that was so terrible it shaped John's entire life? And you're wondering about the other things I found in that box. The documents, the newspaper clippings, the details about his father's death that weren't really an accident. The truth about why a 10-year-old boy was sent to a reformatory in the first place. Because I haven't told you everything. Not even close. I haven't told you about what the letter revealed about John's birth. About who his father really was. About the secret his mother carried that explained why his father came back from the war so violent, so angry, so broken that he eventually took his own life. I haven't told you about what happened to John during those 6 years at Hargrove. The abuse, yes, but there was more than that. There was something specific, something documented in those papers, something that the investigation uncovered, but that was quietly buried because powerful people in the county were involved. I haven't told you about the staff member at Hargrove, the one whose name appeared in multiple documents, the one who John's mother mentioned in her letter with such venom and guilt, the one who did something to John that changed him fundamentally, that made him the way he was. I haven't told you about the connection between John's family and some of the prominent families in our county. The reason why people respected John but also kept their distance. The reason why, when I read certain names in those documents, I recognized them. Families that still live here. Families whose children and grandchildren I see at church every Sunday. And I haven't told you the biggest secret of all, the one revealed in that final letter from his mother. The truth about John's identity that, if it ever came out, would shock this entire community, would change how people see the Tucker family, would explain so much about why John lived the way he did, isolated, controlling, keeping everyone at arm's length. It's a truth that involves money, land, legacy, and lies that go back generations. A truth that powerful people wanted to keep buried. A truth that John's mother tried to protect him from, but ultimately couldn't. When I read that letter, when I understood what she was confessing to him, I realized that John's need for control wasn't just about childhood trauma, it was about survival. It was about protecting himself from people who would have destroyed him if they'd known he knew the truth. And those 7 brides who ran. Now I wonder if some of them found out. If John, in a moment of vulnerability or testing, had revealed something. And they'd run, not because of his personality, but because of what knowing the truth would mean. The danger it would put them in. The secrets they'd be forced to carry. I was the only one who stayed. And now I'm the only one left who knows. John's been dead for 3 years. The people involved in what happened at Hargrove, most of them are dead too. The prominent families whose names appeared in those documents, they're old now. Some of them gone. Maybe it's time to tell the truth. The whole truth. Or maybe some secrets should stay buried with the people who carried them. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. John Tucker was not just a difficult man. He was a man shaped by trauma, by secrets, by a past that he never asked for and couldn't escape. He was a survivor who built a life, a ranch, a family, out of the ashes of a destroyed childhood. And I was lucky enough to be his wife, to love him, to see him, to stay. Those 7 women before me, they made their choices. I made mine, and I'd make the same choice again, knowing everything I know now. Because at the end of the day, marriage isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose broken pieces fit with your strong pieces. Someone whose walls you're willing to climb. Someone whose secrets you're willing to guard. John Tucker was my someone for 52 years, and now, sitting here in this house full of memories, I'm finally ready to tell the rest of the story. The real story. The story that explains everything. But that's not a story for today. That's a story that needs its own telling, its own time, its own space. If you want to know what was in that letter, what happened at Hargrove, why John's father really died, and what secret John's mother revealed about his identity, if you want to know why 7 women ran and why I stayed, if you want to understand the full truth about the farmer that nobody could tame, then you'll have to come back. You'll have to come back for part 2. Because this story, this life, this love, it's bigger than one telling. It's a story about secrets and survival, about trauma and triumph, about a boy who was broken and a man who was rebuilt, about a marriage that everyone thought would fail but lasted half a century. It's a story about rural Kansas in the mid-20th century, about families and power and things that happened in the shadows that nobody talks about reformatories and abuse and cover-ups, about war and violence and mental illness, about lies that were told to protect people and lies that were told to destroy them. And it's a story about me, about how a 16-year-old girl became the woman who could see through all of it, who could love through all of it, who could stay through all of it. So if you want to know, if you really want to know the truth about John Tucker and Helen Tucker and the 52 years we spent together, come back for part 2. I promise you, the truth is bigger than you imagine, more shocking, more heartbreaking, and more beautiful. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about how I tamed the man that 7 women couldn't handle. It's a story about how love, real love, the kind that sees everything and stays anyway, can heal wounds that go back generations. And it's a story about secrets. Secrets that I've kept for over 50 years. Secrets that maybe, finally, need to be told. My name is Helen Tucker. I'm 73 years old. I was married to John Tucker for 52 years. And I know the truth about who he really was. Part 2 is coming. If you want to hear it, let me know. Comment below. Part 2, Helen. We need to know. And I'll come back. I'll tell you everything. Everything.